If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. So on Friday, we got the full Stellar Miracle set list, which is going to be part of our Stellar Crown expansion when it comes out in English. And we're on Pokemon Proxies. We're going to go over all the interesting cards in our first impressions. Going to scooch all the way down to those item cards and trainers to start us off with the Glass Trumpet, which is actually an incredible item card. This is just an item, and you can only play it if you have a Terra Pokemon in play. There's a lot of great Terrestrial Pokemon, not only like evolutions, like think about Charizard and Dragapult and such, but there's also great basic Terrestrials like the Ogerpon EXs, as well as the new Terapagos EX, which is clearly going to be a big card for this. And this is an amazing new energy acceleration option. You get to choose 2 of your benched colorless Pokemon and attach a basic energy from your discard pile to each of them. Now, straight away, Terapagos is both a Terrestrial and a colorless Pokemon, so immediately you could be trumpeting to your Terapagos EX to provide that energy acceleration, but there's also colorless Pokemon like Blissey EX, which naturally have that happy switch ability. So you could have a Terrestrial Pokemon in play, then some Blissey, use the trumpets to move energy onto them, and then they can use their abilities to move energy onto other Pokemon. Equally, just any colorless Pokemon, like things like the new Hoot or Noctowl or whatnot, you can accelerate to those guys, and then if you add in the energy switches, you can just move those energy from here, there, and everywhere. So this is very, very strong. Kind of reminds me of Mirage Gate, really, where you have to go through a few steps to make it happen. Might change how you construct your deck, but the selling point is that you have insane energy acceleration from the discard from an item. So this is going to be a very powerful card, going to be warping how Terapagos decks look, certainly, but also just going to force possibly some Terrastor plus whatever else packages into these decks. We have a couple new fossils. There's the Antique Root fossil, which can evolve into Lileep. As long as this is in the active spot, your opponent's basic Pokemon's attacks cost 1 more. Fine, it's a bit of annoyance, that's fine. And the Protective Shell, which is for the Tortuga, prevents all effects of attacks used by your opponent's Pokemon done to this Pokemon. Damage is not an effect, obviously, so fossils usually are pretty poor, and I don't think these new fossils are all that powerful to build around, so I don't think we have to worry about these too much. There's the Papaya Berry, which is quite an interesting one. Whenever the Pokemon this card is attached to is damaged by an attack from your opponent's Psychic Pokemon, this Pokemon takes 60 less damage from an attack. After applying weakness and resistance, then discard it. As we know, Psychic type coverage is pretty important right now with Gardevoir and all of its partners, so could be a way to be like a counter-style card to that. So I don't necessarily think that's going to be all that played, but it's an option to have in the format. There's also the Ochre Berry, which does the same thing, but for fire Pokemon, and Charizard isn't fire, unfortunately, and that's kind of one of the most relevant Pokemon that uses fire energy at the moment. But yeah, it's something to, again, just have in mind. When you're only really targeting like one type, for these sorts of cards to see play, it has to be a very specific math fix in a very specific matchup. There has to be like a popular enough matchup to make it worthwhile. So I imagine these aren't going to be all that playable, to be honest with you, but I guess they're just things to mention in the format. There are 2 new tools that are A-specs coming in the set. The first one is Sparkling Crystal. The attack cost of the Terra Pokemon this card is attached to is reduced by 1 of any type of energy. A very nice option to have. Like I said, there are some great Terrestrial Pokemon. There's things like Dragapult right now that uses Neo Upper with Pidgeot, and the Sparkling Crystal could be as good, depending on like if there's going to be more E-Hammer versus like Lost Vacuum and stuff like that in the format, which is an interesting tug of war to think about. Also, this could be a great way to reduce some of the other Terrestrial Pokemon we'll look at in this set specifically. I'm thinking definitely the Galvantula would look towards this as their A-spec choice to reduce their attack cost. The other A-spec is the Deluxe Bomb. If the Pokemon this card is attached to is in the active spot and takes damage from an opponent's attack, put 12 counters on the attacking Pokemon, and then if you proc the bomb effect, you then discard the bomb. Certainly a dangerous tool card, but there are multiple ways your opponent can get around this. They can gust around the Pokemon this is attached to and take prizes elsewhere until they find their Lost Vacuum, and I do feel like that's a really big card in the format right now. But if we find ourselves in a spot where there's not enough lists playing tool removal, then you can have a decent chance to really ramp up your damage output. The other tool we gain from the set is the Gravity Stone. If the Pokemon this card is attached to is in the active spot, the retreat cost of both active Pokemon is 1 colorless more. Could certainly be relevant for trapping strategies, but also could be relevant if there are attacks that scale on retreat cost as well. There has been those in the past, so another one of these sorts of cards to keep in mind. Right now, Control has a lot of good like hit point buff tools, which are typically the way to go. because they are going to be leaning like Snorlax based, but maybe this opens the door for other like decent attacking Pokemon that could come into control decks, knowing that this tool can allow you to be effective at trapping as well. There are 4 new supporter cards in the set. The first is Crispin. You get to search your deck for 2 basic energy cards of different types, reveal them and put one into your hand, then attach the other energy to one of your Pokemon. On the surface level, this is reasonable energy acceleration whilst also gathering other colours of energy, so I do think this could be relevant certainly for some like Dragon style decks which have multiple type energy cost, but also a lot of the terrestrial Pokemon we're seeing from this expansion have really wonky attack costs. So again, I'm thinking about Galvantula, possibly even Terapagos could think about having some Crispin in their deck list to provide that bit of energy acceleration, and synergizes nicely with wanting to have like low counts of various different energy types. We then have Lacey, a supporter card that shuffles your hand into your deck, then you draw 4 cards. However, if your opponent has 3 or fewer prize cards remaining, you draw until you have 8 instead. I don't think this is that strong of an effect. Clearly, you barely ever want to use the 4 draw option, but unless you're really in panic stations, and typically when your opponent's at 3 or fewer prize cards like Roxanne and Iono just become far stronger options, so to me this feels a little bit worse than a Cynthia's Ambition, so I don't expect to see a lot of play. Next up we have Kofu. You put 2 cards from your hand to the bottom of your deck in any order, then you draw 4 cards. Again, not a powerful effect. There aren't really too many synergies with the bottom of our deck right now, so I don't really see a reason to play this card. We then have the very terrifying new Briar supporter. You can play this card only if your opponent has exactly 2 prize cards remaining, and until the end of this turn, if your opponent's active Pokemon is knocked out by damage from one of your Terra Pokemon's attacks, take 1 additional prize card. Terra Pokemon are already kind of dominating a number of decks right now. Look at Charizard, look at Dragapult, and there's also going to be some great new Terrastals in this expansion that we'll get onto in a moment, so effectively turning any of those into an Iron Hands in the late game is going to be an insane swing. There's also a lot of ways to force the opponent down to 2 prize cards. Maybe if they're trying to play around it and go down to 3 and then go down to 1, it's possible for you to blow up your own Dusclops, for example, and then force your way down to 2, then pop a Briar and take multiple prizes all in a turn. Also, of course, there could be purely 2 prize attacking builds so that your opponent only has the option to take prizes 2, 4, then 6. Typically, that's quite an effective and easy race for an opponent, but if you're able to go 1, 2, then end on a Briar to take your final 3 prize cards, you could end up still winning that race very often. Especially if you're one of these aggressive 2 prize archetypes that chooses to go second and can initiate an attack on the first turn of the game. Definitely has that sort of boss's orders style aura around it, where this is going to be a game-ending card in a lot of situations. And as more and more terrestrial Pokemon come into the mix, I think this is going to become more and more playable as an option. We have Lemillion, we have the new Noctowl as well, so it's not too much of an ask to just have 1 or 2 copies of this card in the deck and tutor it at the right time to close the game. The other new terrestrial card we get is actually in the form of a stadium, and that's Great Tree. Once during each player's turn, that player may search their deck for 1 stage 1 Pokemon that evolves from one of their basics, put it straight onto that Pokemon, then that stage 1 can immediately evolve into a stage 2 from the deck as well. So think of it like a Rowlet Executor Super Growth attack, where you can go straight from basic all the way up to stage 2 all in 1 turn. Comparing this to something like Rare Candy, which we know is a very searchable item card, it doesn't really compare all that well, honestly. First of all, you're sacrificing any other A-spec option within your deck list just to play this option. Also, your opponent could theoretically take advantage of this, although a lot of other stage 2 decks will just be candy based anyway. But even if they're just a stage 1 deck, they're certainly going to get free search most turns if they keep it in play. And just in terms of space, it might be inefficient to go down this option rather than just having candies anyway. Think about needing to have like a 3-3-3 line of your evolutions compared to a 3-4 candy. That's the same number of cards because you need to have the Great Tree as well. And a Great Tree build gets far more punished by simply being bounced as a stadium card, then having to play cards like Roseanne's Backup to get it back into the deck, compared to Candy, where you just naturally play 4 copies of the card. There is a Chorus's Tenacity, which can search out the stadium card, but there is also the small text at the bottom that says you can't use the effect on a basic Pokemon on your first turn, or on a basic that's been in play this turn. So it's not really like cheating evolution like we've seen from Meganium from the past. It's kind of interesting to me that this can circumvent item lock, and that might be becoming more relevant with Galvantula coming in the format. But on paper right now, it definitely feels like Rare Candy engines are going to be far better than the Great Tree. Mostly because I'm backing an Arvin engine to just be more flexible and useful throughout the entire game than a Chorus's Tenacity engine, which can only really be helpful to get this exact stadium, and you walk into all sorts of issues with prizing and it getting removed from play, having to recycle it, all that stuff is just a major headache compared to having a Candy engine. Let's go to the real stadium of the set, the Area Zero Underdepths. This card is insane. Similar to the Glass Trumpet, you can only use this if you have a Terrestrial Pokemon in play, but that player can have up to 8 Pokemon on their bench. So it's a one-sided Skyfield so long as you have a Terrestrial Pokemon in play. I can't understate how insane opening up your bench is to go all the way up to 8. You can have all sorts of additional ability-style Pokemon in play. You can naturally just hand thin quite happily by putting Pokemon that you draw naturally into play as well. And this is going to be a great way to scale the Terapagos EX's damage output, which we'll come on to in a moment. This could also just end up being reasonable in other archetypes as well. Think about an aggressive Ogerpon archetype that wants to go very wide, like Raging Bolt, for example, could take advantage of this. Even if it ends up only being played in Terapagos, it's still going to be an essential 4-of for that archetype. Jumping up to the Pokemon then, we'll start with Ledian. When you evolve, you can gust up a 90 or less hit point Pokemon. I don't think it's too relevant though. The Morotom's pretty interesting. The Harvesting Dash can discard all tools and special energy cards from your opponent's active Pokemon. Kind of reminds me of the Celebrations Yveltal that could get rid of a lot of special energy. Unfortunately, for an effective attack like this, Mist Energy could protect an opponent from this Harvesting Dash, thinking of things like Lugia. But maybe there's a world where you do an E-Hammer, then Morotom the rest off for some controlling archetypes. Or you could go Temple of Sinnoh to remove the effect of Mist, then dash them all off with this Rotom. We have a Stage 2 Hydrapple EX, 330 hit point grass type that has the Ripe Charge ability. Once during a turn, you can attach a grass energy from your hand to one of your Pokemon. If you do, heal 30 from that Pokemon. And its attack is Syrup Storm. For 2 colours, you do 30 plus 30 more for each grass energy attached to your Pokemon. Looks like this pairs quite nicely with Ogerpon, of course, where you can naturally just get a ton of energy into play. You could even do some kooky stuff with the Glass Trumpet as well if you wanted to have some backup engine Pokemon like Noctowl. But ultimately, by the sounds of things, even with the Ripe Charge ability, you're going to end up just being slower overall than a Raging Bolt deck. You also have criminally low hit points on your evolving Pokemon, which I think really holds this archetype back. The Salazzle can discard 1 card from the opponent's hand, or 3 if it's evolved into Salandit that turn. Definitely a card to think about for hand-locking style strategies. Let's not forget we have the Zoroark Scheme to think about as well in addition to this. We have a Stage 2 Cinderace EX, 320 hit point Fire-type Terrestrial Pokemon, which is becoming more and more relevant, let's not forget, thanks to Briar and the Trumpet. The Flare Strike for Fire and 2 colours does 280 and you can't use that attack next turn. And the Garnet's Volley for Fire, Fighting and Dark does 180 to one of your opponent's Pokemon. Doesn't seem like that much of a selling point. We have a Lapras EX, a basic terrestrial water Pokemon that has the Power Splash attack for 1 water. You do 40 for each energy attached to this Pokemon. Its second attack is the Larimar Rain for 1 water, 1 psychic, 1 metal. You look at the top 20 cards of your deck that attach any number of energy you find there to your Pokemon in any way that you like, then shuffle the other cards back into your deck. Definitely a wild effect with some insane payoff, but let's not forget you are committing 3 energy to the active and spending a turn not dealing any damage to the opponent on what is quite a vulnerable 2-prize Pokemon. So yes, it could set up future Lapras and just a host of other Pokemon options, but it's probably going to be more of a gimmick than a powerful archetype. We mentioned Kofu as a terrible supporter card earlier, and a Crabominable also has an ability that can synergize with the supporter, in that its attacks cost 1 colorless less for each Kofu in your discard pile. So effectively, the Haymaker can attack for just 1 water energy if all 4 Kofu are in the bin. And a 1 for 250 is pretty appealing on a single prize Pokemon, no doubt. But it's going to be that classic issue of getting all those Kofu discarded. It kind of reminds me of Leonzard, probably again more of a gimmick than a powerful archetype, seeing as though we're having to naturally play bad supporters of the deck just to allow this deck to function in the first place. Same deal with the basic Veluza. Its attack is 4 colorless and again does 1 less for each Kofu in your discard pile. So it could be attacking for free, but it's just 110 damage anyway. And it's going to be extremely rare that you can get all of them discarded so early on in the game that you can get early pressure with this card regardless. We have this basic Joltik, which is actually a really intriguing card. It only has 30 hit points, but its attack Battery Charge for 1 colorless allows you to search your deck for up to 2 basic grass energy and up to 2 lightning energy and attach them to your Pokemon in any way that you like. This synergizes really nicely with its own evolution, Galvantula EX, which we'll get onto in a moment, but also could be useful for Terapagos EX, which also has both lightning and grass at its attack cost. But there's even way more rogue options. There's possible future style archetypes. A combination of Iron Leaves EX and Iron Hands EX could be very devastating, and getting 4 energy out of the deck early on and just giving up a single prize could be absolutely insane. Speaking of which, let's get on to that evolution. 260 hit point Lightning type Terrestrial Pokemon. Its attack for 1 Lightning, 1 colorless is simply Charged Web. You do 110 damage, however, if the opponent's active is an EX or V Pokemon, it's 220. As we know, 220, decent number. We can have some buffing tools as well to push us into KOs, into some of the chunkier stuff, so already that's just a decent rate for 2 energy. Its second attack is really intriguing though, the Fulgurite option for Grass, Lightning and Fighting. Yes, these attack costs are hideous, but you have to think about Crispin possibly, and also the Sparkling Crystal as your A-Spec option in the deck. You deal 180 damage and discard all energy from this Pokemon, and during your opponent's next turn, they can't play any items from their hand. There are a lot of Candy Stage 2 decks in the format right now, and even though you are going to have to do big discards and have to constantly upkeep your own Galvantula, even if you just do this 2 turns in a row and delay some Candy Engines that little bit further down the line, you could be getting immense value with this attack, whilst doing very meaningful damage as you go. Let's not forget, of course, your Filler Lightning type, so that's still going to be relevant into the Lugias of the world and Pidgeot EX if they are put into play before you're able to use Fulgurite. Yeah, honestly, a lot to like here, and the Joltic is another big selling point. You use that early, that can get some early Galvantula powered up on the bench, and simply with Crispin here and there, as well as your Crystal A-Spec, I think you could establish a lock for a decent number of turns. There's also a new Charger Bug, which is pretty interesting. Its attack for 1 lightning is line up. You search your deck for 3 Charger Bug and put them onto your bench, just like Mirage Step from Curlier, or Water Duplets from Frogadier back in the day. The new Vikavolt isn't all that fantastic, however, there is a Circuit Cannon Vikavolt that for 2 lightning does 120 base, plus 80 more for each of your Charger Bug on the bench. Assuming the Charger Bug that lined up your others gets KO'd, and you still have to promote a new one evolve into a Vikavolt, that's still likely going to be 2 Charger Bugs on your bench provided you prize none, so that could be a 2 energy 280 swing on a pretty chunky single prize option. The issues, however, will be that sort of upkeep, not only of your energy attack costs, making sure you have that constant supply of Grubbin and Charger Bug, so it could be that classic clunky stage 2 that ends up falling towards the gimmick category more so than the very competitively viable. We have the very interesting Slowking attack here with the Inspiring Challenge for 1 Psychic, 1 Colorless. You discard the top card of your deck. If that card is a Pokemon without a rule box, you can choose one of that Pokemon's attacks and use it as this attack. Obviously, this was going to be just like a ton of work, but there could be some random stage 2 or something you can yoink from. If they have insane energy attack costs, you could get them for a much cheaper cost with this Slowking. Sticking on theme of all these wacky combinations, Drifblim has the Everybody Explode Now attack for 1 Psychic. You do 50 times the number of your Drifblim and Drifloon you have in play, and you deal 30 to each of your Drifblim and Drifloon. High risk, maybe high reward, I don't know. It's difficult to maintain these balloons, again, when you're filling your bench with no Pokemon that can draw you cards. That's a huge handicap in itself, and you're naturally damaging your own guys as you go. And as we know, there's a lot of like bench manipulation and damage output in the format right now. Feels, again, like another big gimmick here. Dash Button has the full-time meal ability, which I suppose is interesting. When you evolve, you can heal all damage from each of your evolution Pokemon if you do discard all energy from the Pokemon healed in this way. So it's similar to a Cheryl from back in the day. We have a stage 1 Marowak, and we're looking at the Bone Revenge option here. For 2 colorless, you do 60, plus if any of your bench Cubone have damage counters on them, this does 120 more damage. So it's an effective 180 for 2 colorless, but there is the Cheering Bone Cubone from 151, which can buff the damage output of Marowak as well here. For each Cubone you have on your bench, this Marowak is doing an additional 30 damage, so it's not that unreasonable to expect, again, getting around that 250 damage output if we're expecting to use double turbo energy for the attack cost, and have 3 bench Cubone. We also have to think about getting some damage counters on our Cubone though, so once again, this is going to fall into the category of doing so much work for not a huge amount of payoff as a single prize option. Is it sad that I'm most excited about this random Rhydon because it's going to go into my cube? We have a stage 1 Medicham EX, a 260 hit point fighting type stage 1. It has the Chi-Atsu attack for 2 colorless. You put counters on your opponent's active Pokemon until it has 50 hit points remaining. So in theory, this is just a huge amount of damage that you could effectively be dealing with this attack if you're trying to hit into certainly some stage 2 EX Pokemon. What I will say though is that there is a lot of like Collapse Stadium and Churro in the format right now. However, using Medicham as like a thin package with a deck that already plays double turbo and is looking to like finish off Pokemon with some snipe damage or some sprinkle counters or whatever could still be pretty effective for archetypes that have that lower damage output threshold. It's a shame that Yoga Kick doesn't have a weakness because I do think that limits the utility of this card as like a tech or thin package within decks. So at the moment, I'm not really expecting a lot from the card. We have an Archer Ludon, which has the Steel Bridge ability. Your Pokemon with any metal energy attached to them have no retreat cost, and it has a 3 for 160. This is probably going to be pretty good for GLC, actually. There's already a very good basic Duraludon that Metal can use. We have the basic Orthworm EX. It's a Metal type 220 hit point Pokemon with the Kapow Return ability. When this Pokemon is damaged by an attack from your opponent's Pokemon, even if it's KO'd, put 2 counters on the attacking Pokemon for each Metal energy attached to this Pokemon. The idea being we can start loading up more and more onto the Orthworm. Maybe some heavy baton shenanigans get into the mix here, and you can just keep having one Orthworm get bigger and bigger as the others get KO'd. and eventually your opponent is taking just a huge chunk of damage for simply attacking into the guy. But the Rock Tomb isn't really all that special of an attack, so I don't really think it's worth building around, even though it could be fun. And now we get to the meat and potatoes, the colourless stuff. I'm going to start with the Terapagos EX. It's a basic 230 hit point colourless type that is also a terrestrial Pokemon. Its first attack is Unified Beatdown. Now you can't use this attack during your first turn going second, however it's a 30 times multiplier for each of your bench Pokemon. And as we know with the new Area 0 Stadium card, we could get up to 240 damage output with this attack. So it is somewhat of a spiritual reprint of Mega Rayquaza, but you'll come to see that it's going to be built very, very differently from those sorts of strategies. And because you can't use that attack going second, it's not really going to be this aggressive basic, I don't think. There's actually going to be other directions for this archetype. And that also could be how the second attack comes into play here. For a Grass, Water, and Lightning cost, we have the Crown Opal attack that does 180 damage, and during your opponent's next turn, prevent all damage done to this Pokemon by attacks from basic non-colorless Pokemon. Seeing as that you can't race people with Unified Beatdown when you're in all basic matchups, like Roaring Moon, Raging Bolt, Future Hands, those sorts of archetypes, it's really important to have this Crown Opal option where you can sort of just slow tank through them instead. Even though your bench may look like Mega Ray, back in the day, Mega Ray was taking one-hit KOs on everything for its setup, and Terapagos is completely different. I actually think this is going to be much more similar to like a Zoro Pod, where you're doing sort of like middling damage output, but trying to be annoying with Crown Opal, or have bouncing potential with Sharon because you're a colorless Pokemon, and there are some Pokemon that can make the Terapagos actually quite a tank. Let's go on to Noctowl. I think this is just by far the best card in the set. Noctowl's a 100 hit point colorless stage 1 Pokemon, and its dual hunt ability, when you evolve into Noctowl, and if you have a terrestrial Pokemon in play, you get to search your deck for 2 trainer cards, reveal them, and put them into your hand. This is a stage 1 Shady Dealing Inteleon, and was just the most dominant engine of its era, so getting this on a stage 1 is absolutely nuts. Trainers is of course encompassing your stadium cards, it's getting you those supporter cards like Crispin in the early game to get set up, or Briar in the late game for those uptrades. It's also worth noting that when your stadium is bounced, you'll be able to discard your Hoot or Noctowl, so then when you replay the Area 0 and have some Pokemon recovery, you can be re-establishing your engine and getting extra dual hunts in the late game. Yeah, overall, Noctowl, crazy card. It's going to be what makes the Terapagos deck tick, and could also be just another huge selling point for other terrestrial archetypes. It very much could be the case where we just have Terapagos, where we just have Ogerpon in decks alongside the Noctowl engine, because it is just so ruthlessly effective for tutoring those trainers to get any deck set up. It's also worth mentioning this Fan Rotom. Its ability is Fan Call. On your first turn, you can search your deck for up to 3 colorless Pokemon with 100 hit points or less, reveal them and put them into your hand, then shuffle your deck. This is getting you your Hoot in the early game, and that's exactly what you want. You can also hold on to a Noctowl for turn 2 as well. So your first turn Ball Search gets you Rotom, that then gets the Hoot army, and that's absolutely crazy. There's also got a 1 for 70 attack, which is like relevant at least at dealing with Mimikyu, and these decks are definitely replaying 4 copies of a stadium, so I wouldn't worry about it failing. Bouffalante's also an intriguing basic if we are going full Terapagos EX. Its Curly Wall ability says that if you have another Boufflant in play, all of your basic colorless Pokemon take 60 less damage from attacks done by your opponent's Pokemon. So Bouffalant does take up effectively 2 bench spaces in order to activate, but it allows the Terapagos to be an effective 290 hit point basic before we've added on hit point buff tools. And that's why I definitely think there could be a 4 double turbo energy build that just uses Sharons, Bouffalants, Noctowls, that sort of thing. Kind of a throwback to Arceus Inteleon. Ultimately, Terapagos is the star of the show for this expansion, and I think there's a lot of ways we can start seeing this see play. I also think the Galvantula is certainly very, very interesting, with item lock becoming more mainstream again. It does feel, however, that with Briar, with Crispin, with Glass Trumpet, even with the Sparkling Crystal, there just seems to be a lot of support around these terrestrial Pokemon. Definitely going to be speeding the game up with so many acceleration options, as well as the Briar for late game swings. So there's no doubt in my mind that Stellar Miracle is an absolutely monster set that's going to be changing the game altogether. Hope you enjoyed today's video. Let me know your thoughts down below, and I'll see you tomorrow for another one. Cheers.